Tonight, John Howard says yes to stem cell research, but key states want to go further. And how wide is the gap between judicial standards and community expectations?
I think that lives don't seem to matter in the judicial system. 8 years isn't enough justice for my daughter.
Judges should be reflecting community standards in sentencing. Talkback Radio is one of the ways to judge community standards.
Welcome to the program, and we're also crossing live to Tel Aviv shortly for the latest on the Middle East. But first tonight, John Howard's cautious green light to stem cell research, which uses existing surplus embryos from IVF programs. But the ethical debate that's now been raging for weeks isn't over yet. Tomorrow, the Prime Minister meets with state and territory leaders, all of them Labor, who broadly support his decision but want him to go further. And when Parliament resumes, he'll face opposition from some members within his own party, who are already planning a private members' bill to put a stop to embryonic stem cell research. Political editor Fran Kelly reports from Canberra.
With the Prime Minister set to give the go-ahead for stem cell research on embryos, the battle lines were drawn in readiness.
We seem to be prepared to go to extraordinary lengths to hide away the needs, considerations, rights of those who can't speak for themselves and those who may not yet constitute a full life as we would see it, but are certainly a potential life. That's a slippery slope ethically. Western society needs to think very carefully about how we value life and how we really are going to respect one another, and the extent to which we're going to allow experimentation on potential lives for the benefit of those who may have a life.
Well, I just think that is Luddite thinking. If that sort of thinking prevails in Australia, then we will go backwards.
I feel passionately about it, and I just said this is one issue where I'm going to make a difference, if I can. And if it meant marshalling arguments as opposed to those of some church people, then so be it.
The proposition here is, rather than their destruction, they should be used for research. They should be used for research into diseases such as Alzheimer's, cancers, diabetes, leukemia, breakthroughs which can happen on shore here in Australia, which can benefit the rest of the world.
And in the end, that's how the Prime Minister saw it.
I am proposing on behalf of the Commonwealth that the Commonwealth and the states and territories should allow the use of surplus ART embryos for research purposes. In other words, allow stem cell research using human embryos.
After weeks of consulting with scientists and church leaders, John Howard finally came down on the side of science, with certain safeguards.
It is restricted to stem cell lines from existing embryos. It does need to be the consent of the donors. It is going to be overseen by the National Health and Medical Research Council. There will be a review after 3 years. There is a total ban on human cloning, and there'll be, and you won't be able, by definition, and it'll be expressly prohibited anyway, create embryos just for the purposes of research. So it is not an open slather approach.
John Howard's decision today surprised many, as he readily acknowledges.
Well, I take a conservative view about conception, yes.
But on this issue of using embryos for life-saving research, John Howard wasn't convinced by the right to life argument because the embryos, surplus from the IVF process, were being destroyed anyway.
There is not in the judgment of many, including myself, a huge moral gulf, or indeed any moral gulf, between allowing an embryo to succumb as a result of being taken out of the freezing condition and in effect exposed to room temperature. I can't for the life of me see a moral difference between that and the use of the embryos in research.
It was the response the scientists had been hoping for.
So all of the scientists are really very happy that they've endorsed all the hard work that's gone into the stem cell research up until this point.
With scientists happy, a blast from the churches was anticipated, though the initial response from those who had personally told John Howard not to give the green light to the embryo research was today quite muted.
Well, at one level, I'm glad for the very careful way in which he's worked. This is a conservative step. From another point of view, I'm very disappointed, however, because I think no step should have been taken in these circumstances.
And in particular, I think that the scientific community will not be satisfied in the end with this, or some members of the scientific community will not be satisfied with this in the end, and will seek for further relaxation of the regulations.
And it seems the Archbishop may be right about that.
Well, I think at that point in time we need to review whether there is any very good evidence that we should be customising the embryonic stem cells for the patients, that is, making them totally compatible for transplantation using the therapeutic cloning procedure. I basically think that we won't be needing to do that at that point in time, but it's very dangerous to sort of second-guess research, particularly research that's moving so quickly.
In other words, the scientists are happy to have fights about therapeutic cloning or restrictions on only using embryos currently in existence further down the track. After all, the legislation comes up for review in 3 years' time under the PM's plan. But the states aren't so happy to wait. They support the ban on human cloning, and this afternoon they applauded John Howard's decision to allow stem cell research using embryos to proceed.
I welcome what the Prime Minister's done today. I think he gets 10 out of 10.
But overall, the states aren't happy with some of the restrictions John Howard's placed on the research.
The idea of saying that we effectively freeze the position so it's only embryos currently in existence, but surplus embryos produced in IVF treatment tomorrow or on Saturday at a clinic can't be used. Now, I think the advice I'm getting from the scientists I'm staying in touch with in New South Wales is that would be restrictive. It's a way of closing down embryonic stem cell research in the future, and I am not going to agree to that.
Tonight, the states agreed to try and push the Prime Minister further on this issue tomorrow, threatening to go it alone in their own states if he doesn't ease the restriction on current embryo stocks.
We will certainly legislate to ensure that our position is enshrined in legislation which enables this research to go ahead.
But John Howard doesn't only have to get his legislation past the states, he also has to get it through the Parliament. And today he offered his party room a conscience vote, ensuring a feisty debate.
This is not an issue where you have a Labor view or a Liberal view or a National Party view. It's an issue where people have individual views, and there are unpredictable stances taken by people.
Simon Crean gave his side a free vote on this issue some weeks ago, and already it's clear the Prime Minister's right. Debate on this issue will cross party lines.
I do not believe that we should be experimenting with human life. I regard an embryo as human life, and I don't believe the potential outcomes from that experimentation justify doing it.
As a matter of conscience, there are aspects of the bill that I would find hard to support.
Enter parliamentary rookie Senator Guy Barnett. He's planning a private member's bill to be announced within weeks.
The probability of a private member's bill or amending legislation, I would say now is around about 100% in light of the outcome today, because quite frankly, Fran, this is a threshold issue.
But John Howard isn't fazed by such a challenge. He admits a conscience vote can be unpredictable. He isn't even guaranteeing how he'll vote on the day. But he is introducing this legislation himself, which ensures almost all on his side will line up behind him. And with the majority of the Labor caucus on side, it should be a walkover.
Political editor Fran Kelly. And now the Middle East. For the moment at least, any semblance of the autonomy in the Palestinian territories that ultimately flowed from the Oslo peace plan of 8 years ago is gone. Israeli military occupation of the West Bank is tonight virtually complete. Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat is effectively a prisoner, his Ramallah headquarters systematically shelled around him. Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon has vowed to smash what he terms the Palestinian terrorist infrastructure that has produced waves of suicide bombers. But what exactly does that mean? And does the Israeli Prime Minister have a political solution in mind beyond his exercise of massive military muscle? Dr. Ron Pundak served in Israel's negotiating team for the Oslo talks and has been involved in various negotiation processes between Israelis and Palestinians since then. He joins me now from Tel Aviv. Ron Pundak, how do you read what is now going to happen beyond these next few days and weeks of occupation?
Well, it's very difficult today to predict the future. It has always been difficult, but somehow I think that what we see today, and I have many difficulties to say it, is that it seems like a pre-plan which was planned by the Prime Minister Sharon since day one when he came into power approximately a year ago. I think from the first day Sharon didn't like the Oslo Agreement. Sharon didn't like the fact that Arafat is staying here in the Palestinian Autonomy and Palestinian National Authority. I think he didn't want to see the PLO leading the situation, and if you ask me, I think that our prospects of peace, which is based on the idea of two independent states side by side, based basically on the June 67 line, give or take, with annexation, a mutual exchange of territories, all these things which were the basics of the Camp David II and the Clinton proposal, all of these things are far away of any plan by our Prime Minister. And in a way, he is now executing his plan.
Can it be convincingly demonstrated that Yasser Arafat is indeed the mastermind of these suicide bombings, the master terrorist?
Well, I would say that in my judgment, Yasser Arafat has done many mistakes since we have started the peace process. But I don't think that his mistakes should have led the situation to where we are. The paradox today is that the one who masterminds most of the attacks against Israel, and this is the leader of the Hamas, which is an extreme fundamental Muslim organization, his name is Sheikh Ahmad Yassin. He is now in Gaza, quite free, quite happy, and probably planning more attacks against Israel. And the one with whom we have signed our agreements and we wanted to make peace with him, Chairman Arafat, is a prisoner in Ramallah, sieged by the Israeli soldiers. I see a paradox here. I still believe that the two states and two nations, the majority of the people, would like to reach peace. And I believe that we can do it. And here in Israel, there are forces which are still working towards this direction. But somehow, if this will continue and if this will deteriorate, I'm afraid that these efforts by the Israeli IDF, which I'm also a reserve man of this force, and I'm proud of it, but still I think that it serves today interests which are, in the long run, are against the well-being and the national real interest of Israel.
When Ariel Sharon talks about smashing the infrastructure of terrorism, how can you define that infrastructure? Can it be defined? Can it be given a clear shape and therefore destroyed?
I think it's very difficult to define it. I think the infrastructure today is more in the minds of the people rather than in the TNT here or Kalashnikov rifle there. I think that the Palestinian struggle is a struggle for independence and liberty, and it's very difficult to crash it. You crash 100, you create a new 1,000. We didn't have so many suicide attackers as we have today when the peace process was quite successful, or even was a bit crippled, but still was moving onward. I don't think that sending Arafat back to Tunis or another Arab state will solve the situation. I don't think that arresting thousands of Palestinians will solve the situation. I believe that the only way is to go forward with the political prospects. We have today a dramatic and historical change in the Arab world based on the Saudi Arabia initiative, which is speaking about a two-state solution, about normal relations between the Israeli and the Arab states. I'm afraid that we might lose this chance. I think that fighting today against the Palestinians, unfortunately, it doesn't lead us anywhere. At the same time, I must admit that we cannot and we should not tolerate bombs in the cities, in the midst of the Israeli cities, and allow this to happen. So we are caught in a terrible junction. But the solution is the political solution. Crashing the so-called infrastructure will crash people, will crash maybe people who are today organized in terrorist cells, but actually it will create more and more hatred, and hatred creates more terrorism.
The Americans, the Europeans, the UN, they're all calling for the parties to return to the negotiating table, which in isolation is an easy call to make, I suppose. But is there any conceivable settlement which would be acceptable to both Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat, and to what extent is the history of enmity between these two men over decades distorted the whole picture?
it has distorted, but I don't think that anybody who had the clear judgment thought that with Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat we can find a final settlement. But what we can find is a lull, is a ceasefire, is a cooling off period which will start moving towards a change, towards in Israel a democratic system which maybe will find another leader to lead us towards the final status agreement. But I hope that the Americans will be strong enough, and together with the Europeans and the rest of the world, if they will not be able to convince the sides to stop the fire and to withdraw the Israeli troops and enter into what we call the Tennant and the Mitchell, which are two plans, tactical plans, but which will lead us to a kind of a ceasefire in the beginning of a political process, then hopefully democratically there will be elections in Israel choosing a different way. The options are there. The Israeli people is a people which would like to support peace, but obviously we need both the political as well as the Palestinian sides environment, or positive and conducive environment, which will allow us to move forward.
Ron Poondak, those are big hopes, but thanks very much for talking with us.
Thank you very much.
It's been a day back here in Australia when once again in our two biggest cities the issues of crime and punishment have filled the airwaves. In Melbourne, the tabloid press and talkback radio are giving voice to public outrage after two teenagers who brutally killed an elderly woman were sentenced yesterday to a minimum jail term of just 4 years. In Sydney, the day after a policeman died after being shot down by criminals, new figures have revealed a steep rise in the incidence of armed robbery in some parts of the city. Predictably, there are strident calls for tougher sentences, and more politicians rush to respond by putting pressure on the courts and directors of public prosecutions to get tougher. In tonight's report by Alison Caldwell, two of our most senior DPPs argue for their independence and the courts.
No, keep your head normal. I think that lives don't seem to matter in the judicial system. They try and get more time for rapists, they try and get more time for other people. These people that have been put crimes on and have been a victim, they are still here to live, to tell their tale. My daughter will never be here.
3 years ago, Kelly Parker's ex-boyfriend killed her 5-year-old daughter, Taylor. Resai Lapama pleaded guilty to manslaughter after a plea bargain reduced the charge from murder. He was sentenced to 12 years prison with an 8-year non-parole period. Kelly Parker was outraged by the sentence and by the decision of the New South Wales Director of Public Prosecutions not to appeal against it.
I had reports from a number of people concerned with the case in my office about it, and on the basis of all of that information determined that an appeal would be unlikely to succeed.
It was Kelly Parker's first experience with the justice system, and it left her feeling angry and helpless.
I think the Director of Public Prosecutions have too much power for one man. And I think that there needs to be an insight into the way that the DPP work. I think there should be an inquiry into the way that they work.
Kelly Parker is not alone in her anger and frustration. Across the country, people whose lives have been devastated by violent crime turn to the media to voice their frustrations with the criminal justice system.
The invalid great-grandmother lived with her intellectually disabled son and was an easy target for the pair.
2 teenagers pleaded guilty to manslaughter after 73-year-old Marie Zaiden was beaten and strangled to death in her Melbourne home 18 months ago. Yesterday, a Supreme Court judge sentenced them to 6 years jail, but with parole and time already served, they could be out in 2.5 years.
It's ridiculous. 4 years for what they did to my grandmother. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, manslaughter, that's a joke.
The case highlights the massive gulf which has developed between the community's expectations of the justice system and the system itself.
If the public has a genuine concern about a situation, they've got every right to express it. Sentencing and the system, it's their system. They've got every right to have a say about it. And I don't see how judges or DPPs or anybody else within the club of the legal system should object to it. Why was this case in particular downgraded from murder to manslaughter?
Well, that's obviously a matter for the DPP, but...
The New South Wales Director of Public Prosecutions, Nicholas Cowdery, points the finger at the media for whipping up a state of moral panic over crime, and at the politicians who listen to them.
Politicians are taking much more notice of what happens on, for example, talkback radio, and incorporating feedback from that source into the formulation of policy. It's a bad thing in that it is not necessarily representative reaction, representative of the whole community.
The relatives of Marie Zaidan now want Victoria's Director of Public Prosecutions to appeal against the sentence of the two teenagers. The state's opposition leader today echoed those calls.
I think the public of Victoria are expressing their outrage in many ways, whether it be through talkback radio, whether it be through discussions in the community, and I think there's every opportunity for the public to contact the DPP and contact the government and demand that this sentence be appealed.
Victoria's Premier, Steve Bracks, argues politicians shouldn't interfere in the judicial process. In the meantime, his government is considering tough new mandatory sentencing laws, along with allowing victims to have more of a say in sentencing.
First, a young mother's desperate fight for justice after her daughter was killed by an ex-lover.
In New South Wales, when Kelly Parker went public with her story, it was seized on by the state opposition, which called for a parliamentary committee to oversee the DPP's decisions. Nicholas Cowdery argues it's an example of how poll-driven politicians try to interfere with the independence of his office.
It's wrong as a matter of principle to have a group of politicians who are interested fundamentally only in the next election reviewing professional decisions that are made within this office on the basis of evidence, the law, which can be very complex at times.
Do you think the role of the DPP is well understood in the community?
No, I don't think it is. I'll come and talk to you about those.
Damien Bugg is the Commonwealth DPP with 16 years' experience as an independent prosecutor. He thinks the media's subjective focus on victims can be damaging.
If people are being unnecessarily encouraged or inappropriately encouraged to believe that the fault lies with either a particular office or a system, and that more drastic action by way of either mandatory sentencing or some legislative intervention or some oversight of the office of the DPP or some compulsion on the courts to impose firmer sentences is the catch cry from the community and the media, and the politicians feel that they have to respond in that way. It puts, in my view, a confused balance to the whole process.
Don't you hate lawyers? Lawyers just think that they are the only smart people on earth. They hate to be questioned by anybody, and particularly lawyers who turn into public servants or turn into politicians.
Claire is hanging on for us in Emu Plains. Hello, Claire.
Formerly the Drive presenter with Melbourne's 3AW, Steve Price is now broadcasting on Sydney's 2UE. He rejects the notion that as a talkback radio host, he's somehow responsible for whipping up moral panic.
People tend to point the finger at talkback radio and say this is all hysterical, this stuff, and we shouldn't be listening to it, and people like Bob Carr and people like Steve Bracks shouldn't be at the beck and call of talkback radio hosts. Of course they shouldn't be, but they should listen to what the community's saying.
It's a view shared by Melbourne's Neil Mitchell.
Judges should be reflecting community standards in sentencing. Talkback radio is one of the ways to judge community standards. It's not the only way, and it's not a foolproof way, and some politicians do play the populist game, but I think they should listen to talk radio. I think they should listen to the public.
I think the electorate will be cynical and will be critical of any politician who beats the drum and says, OK, the election is simply a referendum on our plan for tougher sentences.
New South Wales Premier Bob Carr has already introduced mandatory life sentences for crimes such as drug trafficking and issued sentencing guidelines for judges hearing gang rape cases. Even so, he claims that's no threat to the independence of the judiciary.
We've got the right, under the law of the land, to go to the court and present a submission to the Court of Criminal Appeal for sentencing guidelines. So that is using the court system in a reasonable and responsible way.
Nicholas Cowdery maintains that for every controversial case, many more are resolved to the satisfaction of all parties.
We have thousands of cases going on in this state every year, thousands. Only a few make it into the newspapers or onto radio, and it's usually because they are controversial because of the nature of the case or because something has gone wrong. So they're not representative of the huge number of cases that run through the courts without any controversy at all.
But that's little comfort for Kelly Parker.
I feel like as if they've just let me down just as much. 8 years isn't enough justice for my daughter. I mean, I can't employ my own lawyer. They are the lawyers that have to do the job for my daughter and myself. And as far as I'm concerned, they haven't done that job.
And the Victorian DPP is considering whether to appeal against that sentence in the Zyden case. Alison Caldwell with that report. And to end the program, hopefully with a laugh, here's John Clark with Brian Dorr for their weekly Watch on Politics.
Mr. Ruddock, thanks for your time.
Oh, it's very good to be with you. Thank you.
How's the war going?
The war is going fairly well at the moment, although I wouldn't want to give the impression by saying that it's going to be over quickly or that this is going to be an easy time for the country, because that is not the case.
But we're very determined, aren't we?
We are a very, very determined people, yes.
And we're not going to give up?
No, we're not. We're going to fight them on the landing grounds. We will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them in the air.
In the newspapers?
We will fight them in the newspapers. We will fight them on the television. We will never surrender.
Yes, exactly. Incidentally, Mr. Ruddock, what is that thing on your suit there?
That's an Amnesty badge. I'm a member of Amnesty, the human rights organisation, and their badge is a little bit small. I think a lot of people don't notice that I wear it all the time.
Right. Mr. Ruddock, what is the main danger at the moment?
The main danger, quite clear and present danger, is the risk that this country will be taken over by illegal immigrants.
Yes, because this has happened before, hasn't it?
I beg your pardon? What's happened before?
Well, the country has been conquered by illegal immigrants before.
No, I think history will bear me out here. I think it was at one stage liberated by geniuses, but I don't know that it's ever been taken over by illegal immigrants.
So are these illegal immigrants?
No, in this case, these people in the detention centres are not illegal immigrants, no.
No, because they have a right to immigrate, don't they?
They do have a right under the rather foppish international law to immigrate, yes.
So what you're saying is they're not illegal?
Yeah, they're not immigrants either, technically speaking.
Why not?
Because we're bloody not letting them in.
So, Mr. Ruddock, what's going to happen to them?
Well, they're going to wait in the detention centres until such time as we process their applications.
And how long will that take?
We're doing it as fast as possible, Brian.
Right. Was that a wink?
Pardon?
Sorry, no. Mr. Ruddock, does this recent escape concern you?
It does. It puts really the whole country at risk. It's very unsettling.
We could all be murdered in our beds.
Well, I think, frankly, we were a little bit lucky to get the genie back in the bottle over Easter. Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few newspaper proprietors.
And what can happen if to people who help these detainees escape?
If people help these people escape, they can be arrested and they can be jailed for up to 5 years.
For housing criminals?
For giving succour to the enemy, yes.
Can you be hanged?
I couldn't be bothered, no, but a lot of people can be, apparently.
Have you thought about introducing a bounty?
Oh, look, I think people are mutinous enough without signing up for the full
democracy
catastrophe.
Yeah. So what is going to happen, do you think, Mr. Ruddock?
Well, I think the Queen Mother's funeral's on Tuesday, isn't it?
Queen Mother's funeral.
Yeah, I think that's on Tuesday. That'll obviously fill the newspapers on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
Yeah, so we'll just wait and see what happens.
Yeah, I'll give you a whistle. We may have to blow it up again. We may have to release some new story.
Sure.
And
take it from there.
I'll give you a whistle. On the mobile?
Yeah, you got my mobile number? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, see you at the golf on Monday.
Yeah, okay. Are my clubs in your boot?
Yeah.
Okay. I think your boot's in my club.
That's the program for tonight and the week. Don't forget State Line at this time tomorrow. We'll be back at the same time on Monday, but for now, good night.